Welcome to Sleepy Study Guides. This is a study guide for Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. It's designed to be listened to slowly, at your own pace, without pressure or urgency. You can use it while studying, while resting, or simply as a way to spend time with the story in a quieter, more thoughtful way. The guide is divided into 5 chapters. The first 2 prepare you for the novel, its tone, its title, and what to notice as you read. The 3rd chapter walks through the story itself. The 4th explores the patterns and people at the heart of the book. And the 5th offers space to let everything settle. There's no quiz at the end, no required response, just an invitation to slow down and pay attention. The narration will end after Chapter 5, but the video will continue with gentle sounds and visuals for those who want to stay a while longer. Whenever you're ready, we'll begin. Chapter 1. Settling In. Before anything happens in the story itself, there's something worth saying about how to arrive here. This isn't a book that asks for speed or cleverness. It doesn't rush its meaning, and it won't reward skimming. What it asks for is patient attention, the human kind, the kind you offer when you're listening instead of performing. Wherever you are right now, that's enough. You don't need to prepare yourself beyond being willing to stay. Of Mice and Men is often called short, and it is. You could read it in a single sitting if you wanted to. Because of that, people sometimes treat it as simple, as if fewer pages must mean fewer ideas. But this story carries its weight quietly. It doesn't announce what it's doing, meaning accumulates through repetition, through small moments, through things left unsaid. What matters isn't how fast you finish. It's how much you notice along the way. The world of the novel is shaped by instability. It's set during the Great Depression, a time when steady work was rare and security fragile. Men traveled from place to place looking for jobs that might last a few weeks, maybe months, never knowing when they'd be forced to move on. Home was temporary. Belongings were limited. The future was something you hoped for but rarely trusted. You don't need to memorize historical facts to understand this world. You can feel it in how people speak, in how little they expect, in how carefully they guard what matters to them. The setting reflects that feeling. Most of the story happens on a ranch in rural California, surrounded by open land rather than towns or cities. Days are filled with physical labor, evenings with routine and repetition. There's little privacy and little distraction. In that kind of space, people become aware of one another without necessarily growing close. Loneliness doesn't disappear just because others are nearby. The style of the book matches this environment. The language is plain and direct. Descriptions are brief. Dialogue carries most of the weight. There's no guiding voice stepping in to explain what you should think or how to judge. Instead, meaning emerges through behavior, through patterns, through moments that echo each other quietly. This can feel understated at first, but it's deliberate. The story trusts you to pay attention. At the center of the novel are 2 men who travel together, and that fact alone is unusual. Most of the workers in this world move alone, keeping connections shallow so departures hurt less. Having a companion means responsibility, compromise, vulnerability. It also means protection. Before you know anything else about them, the presence of this partnership signals that the story is interested in connection, not just survival. As the book begins, the tone is calm. The opening scene happens in nature, away from work and conflict. The pace is slow, the air feels still. This quiet beginning matters. It creates a sense of balance before tension enters, and it offers a place of return, literally and emotionally. The stillness isn't accidental. It gives the story room to breathe before choices begin to narrow. Even early on, you might notice a feeling of something being held carefully in place. Plans are mentioned, rules are repeated, instructions are given with precision. These moments might seem minor, but they matter. They suggest things have gone wrong before, and the characters are trying, in their limited ways, to prevent that from happening again. There's an undercurrent of caution beneath the calm. This is also a story about wanting something better without knowing how to reach it safely. The characters aren't dreamers in a grand sense. Their hopes are modest and practical. They want rest, dignity, security, a place where they belong. The simplicity of those desires makes them powerful. It also makes their absence harder to ignore. Right now, you don't need to analyze themes or symbols. You don't need to decide what the story is about yet. That understanding will come naturally as events repeat and patterns emerge. For now, just notice the tone, the setting, the sense of quiet preparation. The book is inviting you to slow down and observe before it asks you to judge. As you move forward, let the story speak at its own pace. Listen to what gets repeated. Notice what's protected. Pay attention to who has control and who doesn't. These details will matter later, not because they're emphasized, but because they're consistent. This opening chapter is a settling in, not just for you, but for the story itself. It establishes a world where stability is rare, companionship is precious, and the future is something people talk about carefully, as if saying it too loudly might cause it to disappear. That's the ground the story stands on. From here, it begins to move. Chapter 2. A thought about the title. Before the story fully opens up, there's something worth pausing with. The title itself, Of Mice and Men. It doesn't sound dramatic or emotional. It doesn't hint at adventure or conflict. Instead, it feels reflective, almost distant, as if it's looking at human life from a step back. That tone matters. It prepares you for a story that observes rather than explains. The phrase comes from an old poem, and even without knowing the poem itself, the idea behind the title is easy to feel. It suggests planning, effort, intention, and then the quiet understanding that none of those things guarantee results. Life doesn't always cooperate with even the most careful hopes. Things break, circumstances interfere, outcomes drift away from what was imagined. What makes this title especially fitting is the comparison it makes. Mice are small, fragile, constantly at risk. They build, hide, gather, plan. But their world is full of forces they can't control. By placing men alongside mice, the title gently strips away the illusion of human certainty. The people in this story aren't masters of their fate. They're vulnerable, often unseen, easily undone by events they never intended. This comparison also encourages empathy. Mice aren't blamed for failing. They're understood as doing what they can with what they have. In the same way, the title invites you to look at the characters not as careless or foolish, but as people trying to survive within limits that were never of their choosing. It quietly asks you to soften your judgment before the story even begins. The title also hints at one of the novel's central tensions, the space between dreaming and reality. Planning isn't mocked in this book. In fact, Planning is one of the few things that gives the characters comfort. Imagining a future helps them endure the present. But the title reminds you that planning doesn't equal control. Dreams exist alongside uncertainty, and hope doesn't come with protection. Notice what the title doesn't promise. It doesn't suggest success, triumph, or transformation. It doesn't imply that effort will be rewarded. Instead, it frames the story as an exploration of trying, of hoping, of living with outcomes that don't always feel fair. That framing allows the novel to be honest without being cruel. There's also something gentle about how the title sounds when spoken aloud. It moves slowly. It lingers. That rhythm matches the pacing of the book itself, which often pauses for conversation, repetition, quiet moments rather than rushing from event to event. The title asks you to read patiently, to notice patterns rather than chase conclusions. As the story unfolds, you'll see that many characters carry plans of their own. Some of those plans are shared. Others are deeply private. What the title prepares you for isn't the failure of those plans, but the emotional cost of holding them. To hope in an unstable world is risky, but to stop hoping entirely is its own kind of loss. You don't need to analyze the title while you read. You don't need to remember where it came from. What matters is the feeling it establishes. The sense that life is unpredictable, that effort and outcome don't always align, and that people keep imagining better futures anyway. With that understanding quietly in place, the story can begin to move forward. Chapter 3. The Story Slowly Told. The story begins in a place that feels briefly removed from obligation. A river runs quietly near the town of Soledad, its surface steady, reflecting the fading light of evening. The water doesn't hurry, doesn't react. It simply moves the way it always has. Trees line the bank, their leaves barely stirring, and the ground is worn smooth by years of passing feet. This is a place meant for stopping, for catching your breath, for existing without being watched. That calm matters. It gives the story a place to begin before anything needs to be decided. Two men come down the path as the light softens. Their clothes are dusty, their bodies tired in the way that comes from long travel rather than rest. One of them, George, is small and tightly wound, alert even as he pauses. His eyes scan the area automatically, as though trouble might rise out of the quiet itself. The other, Lenny, is very large, moving through the world with heavy steps and little awareness. He's drawn immediately to the river, kneeling to drink deeply, splashing water onto his face and shirt. George reacts with sharp concern. He tells Lenny to stop, to slow down, to think. Lenny looks up, confused, already apologizing. He doesn't understand the danger, only that George is upset. When George discovers that Lenny is carrying a dead mouse in his pocket, his frustration deepens. Lenny likes soft things. He can't explain why. He only knows the comfort of touch. George, worn down by experience, knows exactly how this pattern ends. As they talk, their past becomes clearer. They've just come from another town where Lenny frightened a young woman by grabbing her dress. Lenny didn't mean harm. He panicked when she reacted, and panic spread quickly. George knows how fast fear turns into accusation. They had to leave in a hurry. This isn't the first time. George's anger is edged with exhaustion, not cruelty. He's lived this moment before. Before they sleep, George gives Lenny a clear, careful instruction. If anything goes wrong at the new job, Lenny is to return to this exact spot by the river and wait. The instruction isn't dramatic, but it's heavy. It sounds practiced. It suggests that George expects things to go wrong even as he hopes they won't. The riverbank becomes more than a resting place. It becomes a contingency, a quiet acknowledgement that plans are fragile. As darkness settles, George tells Lenny the story they both love. He talks about a small piece of land, about working for themselves, about not having to answer to a boss. Lenny listens with complete focus, repeating familiar lines at the right moments, especially the part about tending rabbits. This story has been told many times before. It's ritual. It calms Lenny and steadies George. For a few moments, the dream feels solid enough to hold. Morning arrives, and movement begins again. The men reach the ranch, and the tone shifts immediately. The openness of nature gives way to rules and hierarchy. There are expectations here, spoken and unspoken, and Lenny can't see them. George can. He answers questions quickly, positioning himself between Lenny and scrutiny. The boss notices Lenny's silence and George's control, questioning the arrangement. George explains, offering a partial truth about Lenny being injured as a child. It's enough, but suspicion lingers. Curly appears soon after. He's restless and sharp, aggressive without invitation. He fixes on Lenny immediately, threatened by his size. George recognizes danger at once and warns Lenny to stay away from him. Another rule is added, another invisible boundary Lenny will struggle to remember. Life on the ranch settles into rhythm. Days are long and physical, filled with work that leaves little room for thought. Evenings stretch slowly in the bunkhouse. The men play cards, argue, complain, talk about nothing in particular. It's shared space without shared closeness. Most of the men are alone by habit, careful not to form attachments that would make leaving harder. Candy becomes a quiet fixture in these evenings. He's been on the ranch longer than most, and his missing hand marks him as someone already past his prime. He knows it, and everyone else does too. His old dog lies nearby, barely moving, its presence so familiar, it's almost invisible. The dog has followed Candy for years, through different jobs and places, long after its usefulness has faded. One night, the dog becomes a problem that can no longer be ignored. The men complain about the smell, about the noise, about how the animal no longer has any quality of life. The decision forms quickly. Someone should take the dog out and put it down. Candy protests weakly, his voice uncertain, his resistance half-formed. In the end, he lets the others decide for him. When the dog is gone, the bunkhouse feels emptier in a way that's hard to name. Candy lies on his bed, staring upward, listening to the sounds of the ranch without the familiar presence beside him. Regret settles in slowly. He realizes too late that he should have acted himself, that allowing others to make the choice has left him with a deeper kind of loss. Later, Candy overhears George telling Lenny the dream. The small farm, the land, the idea of working for themselves. Something shifts. Candy doesn't interrupt at first. He listens. He measures the idea carefully, the way someone does when they've been disappointed before. Then he speaks. He offers his savings, money carefully collected over years, to help make the dream real. For the first time, the dream changes shape. It's no longer just something repeated for comfort. It becomes something discussed seriously. Numbers are mentioned. Timelines are imagined. For a brief while, hope feels practical. Even George allows himself to believe that this future might actually arrive. Crooks lives apart from the others in a small room off the barn. It's separate from the bunkhouse, both physically and socially. The space is sparse but carefully kept, lined with personal items that suggest a life built inward rather than outward. Crooks has learned to guard what little control he has. One evening, Lenny wanders into Crook's room, drawn by loneliness rather than curiosity. Crooks reacts with anger at first, defensive of the one place where he isn't watched or judged. As the tension eases, Crooks begins to talk. He speaks of isolation, of what happens to a person when they have no one to talk to, no one to confirm what's real. He describes how loneliness changes the mind, how thoughts grow heavy when they have nowhere else to go. When Lenny mentions the farm, Crooks laughs bitterly. He's seen too many men with plans, too many promises that dissolve before they can take shape. He insists that nobody ever gets the life they talk about. And yet, as the conversation continues, something softens. Crooks begins to imagine what it would be like to belong somewhere, to have a stake in something that lasts. For a brief moment, hope slips in. That moment doesn't last. Curly's wife enters the room, her presence immediately shifting the balance. Her words are sharp, reminding Crooks how vulnerable he is, how quickly his safety could disappear. The room tightens. Crooks withdraws, retreating from the dream he just allowed himself to touch. Hope closes back in on itself, smaller and more dangerous than before. The final turning point arrives without warning and without noise. It doesn't announce itself as a climax. It unfolds quietly, almost gently, inside the barn during the heat of the afternoon. The space smells of hay and animals, of dust and warmth. Light slips in through the cracks in the boards, hanging in the air. It's a place meant for stillness, not for decisions. Curly's wife enters alone. For once, she isn't searching the bunkhouse or calling out into doorways. She sits and talks, filling the quiet with words, with stories of disappointment and lost attention. When she speaks of her past, of the life she imagined for herself, the tone shifts. For a moment, she isn't simply a danger or a distraction. She's someone who wanted more than what she was given. Lenny listens. He doesn't understand everything she says, but he understands the sound of her voice and the softness of her presence. When she invites him to touch her hair, he hesitates, remembering George's rules. But she reassures him, and the comfort of softness draws him in. When she panics, when her voice sharpens and her body pulls away, Lenny panics too. He tries to stop her from yelling. He doesn't intend harm. He only wants the moment to return to calm. It doesn't. When the movement stops, the barn becomes unbearably quiet. The animals remain still. The dust settles. Lenny stands frozen, unable to understand what's happened. He knows only that something has gone terribly wrong. Fear takes over. He remembers George's instruction. He runs. By the time the others find the barn, the shape of what's happened is already clear. Words are spoken, accusations rise, and the sense of inevitability tightens. Curly's anger hardens into something cold and determined. A search forms quickly, not to understand, but to end the problem. Lenny reaches the riverbank as the light begins to change again. The same water moves past him, unchanged, indifferent. He sits where he was told to sit, waiting. He doesn't hide well. He doesn't think beyond obedience. His fear mixes with hope, because George said, he would come. George does come. When George sees Lenny, the relief is immediate, followed almost instantly by understanding. He knows what will happen next if he does nothing. He knows the kind of end the others will offer. The riverbank, once a place of rest, becomes a place of decision. George sits beside Lenny and speaks calmly. He doesn't scold, he doesn't explain. Instead, he tells the story again. The same story. The land, the house, the animals. Lenny listens, his breathing slowing, his attention narrowing to the familiar images. The future returns, clear and simple, just as it always has. As Lenny imagines the rabbits, George makes his choice. The sound breaks the quiet, then the quiet returns. The river keeps moving. The leaves still barely stir. Nature doesn't react. It never does. The others arrive moments later, but what matters has already happened. The urgency drains out of the scene, leaving behind only stillness and weight. George stands apart, not triumphant, not relieved, just emptied. He's done what he believed there was no other way to avoid. The story ends where it began, by the river, but nothing feels the same. The dream has dissolved. The companionship that made survival bearable is gone. What remains is the quiet understanding that sometimes people are forced into choices they never wanted to make, in worlds that don't offer mercy easily. The river moves on, the light fades, and the story closes, not with resolution, but with silence. Chapter 4. People, Patterns, and Meaning. By the time the story is finished unfolding, there's a natural impulse to rush forward and ask what it all meant, to sort events into lessons or arguments. But Of Mice and Men doesn't invite that kind of urgency. It asks for slower attention, the kind that lingers with people rather than outcomes. The plot has already done its work. What remains are the lives that moved through it, shaped quietly by forces that were often invisible while they were at work. When you look back at the story this way, patterns begin to appear. Not dramatic twists, but repeated experiences that echo across different lives. Loneliness appears again and again, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes carried in silence. Hope rises briefly, offering relief before retreating under pressure. Power shifts unevenly from one person to another, determining whose choices matter and whose don't. These patterns aren't explained or emphasized. They simply persist, shaping the story from beneath. At the center of these patterns are George and Lenny, whose relationship immediately sets them apart. In a world where most men travel alone, their companionship is unusual enough to raise suspicion. Depending on someone else is risky here. It creates responsibility, attachment, the possibility of loss. George and Lenny accept that risk, even if they don't fully name it. Their bond offers protection, but it also carries cost. George often speaks of how much easier his life would be if he were alone, free from worry and responsibility. Yet those complaints exist alongside clear loyalty. He stays, he plans, he watches constantly for danger. His frustration reveals how exhausting care can be in a world that offers no support for it. Lenny, in turn, depends completely on George, not just for safety, but for understanding. George interprets the world for him, sets boundaries, keeps the dream alive through repetition. That companionship creates a tension between protection and limitation. George shields Lenny from harm, but he also controls Lenny's choices, deciding where they go, what Lenny is told, how much of the future Lenny is allowed to imagine. The novel doesn't judge this arrangement. It presents it as necessity, shaped by circumstances that allow no better option. In this way, the relationship is both refuge and constraint. Lenny's place in the story brings one of the novel's most difficult ideas into focus: innocence without safety. Lenny doesn't intend harm. His desires are simple and direct. He wants reassurance, comfort, softness in a world that rarely provides them. Yet his strength, combined with his limited understanding, makes him dangerous. The tragedy isn't that Lenny is malicious, but that the world has no space for someone who can't regulate himself according to its rules. Through Lenny, the story asks whether good intentions matter when outcomes are destructive. It also asks who bears responsibility when harm is caused without malice. Lenny is punished not because he chooses wrong, but because he can't choose differently. The systems around him are designed to remove problems quickly, not to accommodate vulnerability. His innocence isolates him rather than protecting him. George's burden grows heavier when seen through this lens. From the beginning, he's the one who anticipates consequences before they arrive. He knows what Lenny forgets. He understands how the world will respond, even when Lenny can't imagine it. This awareness gives George control, but it also leaves him alone. Knowing more means worrying more. George is never fully at rest, because rest would require trust in a future he doesn't believe will hold. Responsibility shapes George's life quietly and constantly. Every decision must account for Lenny. Where they go, how long they stay, how much they reveal, how carefully they behave. All calculated. George sometimes imagines a life without this weight. But that imagined freedom feels thin. Without Lenny, George would have fewer worries. But he'd also have no one who truly belongs to him, and no one he truly belongs to. Candy's story reflects a different fear, but it arrives at the same place. He's old, missing a hand, deeply aware that his usefulness is fading. The ranch values speed and strength. Candy knows that once those disappear, security disappears with them. His dog becomes a mirror for that fear. Loyal long after it's useful, the dog is tolerated until it becomes inconvenient. When the men decide the dog should be killed, they frame it as kindness and practicality. Candy protests weakly, then gives in. Afterward, regret settles in. Candy realizes that by allowing others to decide, he's surrendered control. The loss isn't just emotional, it's existential. He sees his own future in the dog's fate and understands how easily his life could be judged the same way. This is why the dream of the farm matters so deeply to Candy. It offers agency. On the farm, Candy would belong by right, and not by tolerance. Age and injury wouldn't erase his worth. His investment in the dream isn't only financial. It's an attempt to reclaim control over his own ending. Crooks lives with a version of this powerlessness that's more permanent. His isolation is enforced by race, not circumstance. He lives apart, separated physically and socially, and this separation shapes how he understands the world. Crooks has learned to guard himself carefully because hope has always been dangerous. Wanting too much has never been safe. When Crooks speaks of loneliness, he does so with clarity. He understands how isolation alters the mind, how thoughts grow heavier without someone else to steady them. His brief willingness to imagine joining the farm is striking because it's so rare. For a moment, he allows himself to believe that belonging might be possible. When Curly's wife reminds him of his vulnerability, that hope collapses immediately. Crooks withdraws, not because he stops wanting, but because wanting has always carried consequences. Curly's wife occupies another form of confinement. She moves freely through the ranch, yet she's defined almost entirely by her role. The fact that she's never given a name signals how she's seen, not as a person, but as a problem, an extension of someone else. Her restlessness isn't random. It's the result of being trapped in a life that offers status without companionship and attention without understanding. When she speaks honestly about her dreams, they're not extravagant. They're familiar. Recognition, purpose, a different future. Like the others, she wanted more than what she was given. Her attempts to connect are treated as threats rather than needs. This doesn't excuse the harm she causes, but it does reveal its roots. The dream of the farm becomes the one place where these separate lives briefly overlap. It begins as a private comfort between George and Lenny, then grows as Candy and Crooks listen. As it becomes shared, it shifts from fantasy to possibility. It becomes a language for dignity, stability, belonging. While the dream is alive, the present feels different. People speak differently. They imagine themselves differently. This is why the collapse of the dream is so painful. It's not just the loss of land or plans. It's the loss of a shared vision that briefly united people who'd been isolated for years. When the dream disappears, each character returns to their original position, but with sharper awareness of what they're missing. Violence marks the points where these patterns tighten. The killing of Candy's dog establishes how quickly inconvenience is removed. The crushing of Curly's hand exposes how fragile order really is. The death of Curly's wife completes the escalation. Each moment narrows the range of choices. By the time the final decision arrives, the story has already shown how little flexibility this world allows. George's final act exists in moral uncertainty. To do nothing would mean surrendering Lenny to a brutal end. To act means carrying the weight of that choice forever. The novel doesn't settle this dilemma. It refuses to provide moral clarity. Instead, it asks readers to sit with discomfort, to recognize that some choices hurt no matter which path is taken. As the story closes, there's no restoration of balance. Life continues. The ranch remains. The river flows on. Individual suffering doesn't alter the larger system. This contrast between personal loss and collective indifference is deliberate. It reminds you how easily pain can be absorbed without acknowledgement. Of Mice and Men lingers not because it explains itself, but because it leaves questions unresolved. It suggests that kindness doesn't always save, that hope doesn't always protect, and that caring can sometimes lead to loss rather than reward. And yet, it also insists that connection matters, even when it can't last. The novel offers no comfort, but it offers honesty. And in that honesty, it asks you to keep noticing, to keep listening, and to sit quietly with what doesn't resolve. Chapter 5. Letting It Settle. In the space after the ending, attention naturally settles on George. For most of the novel, his life has been shaped by responsibility. He plans, anticipates, corrects. His future is organized around Lenny's needs. When that responsibility disappears, what remains isn't freedom in any simple sense. The weight is gone, but so is the connection that gave his life structure and meaning. George is left with what he once imagined he wanted: the ability to move on alone, without explanation, without delay. But now that freedom feels hollow, the dream that once gave direction to his planning has vanished, and the companionship that made endurance possible has disappeared with it. What remains is movement without purpose, choice without hope. This is the quiet tragedy that lingers after the story ends. George survives, but survival isn't presented as victory. The novel doesn't suggest that endurance alone is enough. Instead, it shows how deeply people can be shaped by those they care for, and how empty the world can feel when that bond is broken. George is no longer burdened by responsibility, but he's also no longer anchored by it. When Of Mice and Men ends, it doesn't leave behind a sharp sense of completion. Instead, there's a quiet heaviness, the kind that settles slowly rather than arriving all at once. The mind doesn't rush toward conclusions. It lingers. That lingering is intentional. The book doesn't close with a lesson meant to energize or resolve. It closes by allowing the weight of what happened to rest without being explained too quickly. This matters, especially after a story shaped by motion and instability. The men move from place to place. Jobs begin and end abruptly. Safety is always temporary. When the movement finally stops, it doesn't bring relief. It brings quiet. And that quiet can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it doesn't tell you what to feel next. The novel doesn't hurry you toward understanding. It trusts that understanding, if it comes at all, will come later. The feeling the ending leaves behind isn't shock. The final events are intense, but the story doesn't ask you to react loudly. Instead, it leaves you with a stillness that feels heavy rather than empty. The silence after the last decision stretches outward, not just across the riverbank, but across the world of the novel itself. Life continues. The ranch remains. The routines resume. Nothing stops moving, even though something essential has been lost. That unresolved quiet is part of the story's meaning. If the ending offered clarity or reassurance, it would suggest that the pain served a purpose that could be neatly understood. Instead, the silence suggests something harder to accept: that suffering doesn't always explain itself, and that endings don't always justify what came before. The story closes without telling you whether what happened was right or necessary. It simply allows the moment to stand. As the quiet deepens, the dream naturally returns to mind. Not as a plan and not as a failure, but as something that mattered while it existed. The dream of the farm didn't collapse because it was foolish or naive. It collapsed because the world the characters lived in didn't make room for it. Imagining a better life wasn't the mistake. Believing in it briefly gave shape and warmth to lives that were otherwise narrow and unstable. For George, Lenny, Candy, and even Crooks, the dream offered dignity. It allowed them to imagine themselves as people with control over their own time and labor, people whose worth didn't depend entirely on strength, youth, or approval. Even though the dream doesn't survive, the act of imagining it still changes the story. For a short while, it softens the characters. It brings them closer. It gives them something to move toward instead of something to endure. In that sense, the dream succeeds even as it disappears. It reveals what the characters value and what they lack. It shows how deeply the desire for stability and belonging runs, even in lives trained not to expect it. The novel doesn't treat dreaming as weakness. It treats it as evidence of humanity, fragile but persistent. As the dream fades, the story leaves behind questions rather than answers. Was George's final choice an act of mercy or an act of control? Did he protect Lenny, or did he decide for him in the most permanent way possible? Would doing nothing have been more cruel or less? The novel refuses to settle these questions, not because they're unimportant, but because settling them would simplify something that's meant to remain uneasy. This refusal is deliberate. Of Mice and Men resists being turned into a moral equation. It doesn't reward readers with certainty. Instead, it presents responsibility, intention, and consequence as tangled together, impossible to separate cleanly. The story suggests that real moral choices often happen in conditions where clarity is unavailable and harm can't be avoided. Looking outward, beyond individual choices, the world of the novel continues unchanged. The ranch doesn't transform. The system that placed these men together and pulled them apart remains intact. Work continues. Jobs will be filled. New men will arrive with their own small hopes, and those hopes will be shaped by the same pressures. Individual suffering doesn't disrupt the larger structure. This is one of the novel's quietest and most unsettling ideas. Pain matters deeply to the people who experience it, but it doesn't register on a larger scale. The world doesn't pause. It absorbs loss and moves forward. In showing this, the story doesn't suggest cruelty for its own sake, but indifference as a silent force. Systems persist not because they're malicious, but because they're uninterested. And yet, the novel lasts. It lingers because it leaves space rather than filling it. It changes as readers change. What stands out on a first reading may fade, while something quieter takes its place later on. Loneliness grows sharper. The dream feels more fragile. The limits around the characters become more visible. The book allows that shift. It doesn't insist on one meaning or one response. As this guide comes to a close, there's no need to gather conclusions or prepare answers. The story doesn't ask to be solved. It asks to be sat with. The questions it raises don't demand immediate resolution. They're meant to settle slowly, carried forward into other moments, other readings, other lives. If there's any invitation here, it's a gentle one. To notice how connection matters even when it can't last. To recognize that caring, even briefly, still shapes who we become. The novel offers no comfort, but it offers honesty. And in that honesty, it leaves room for rest. The story has been told. The rest can wait. That's where the guide ends. The video will continue with soft sounds and visuals if you'd like to stay a while longer. No narration, just a gentle space to rest or drift off. If this helped you spend time with the story in a quieter way, consider subscribing. There are more guides like this one and more on the way. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.